So let's actually turn episode 300 into a real episode where we talk about identity.
Nah, I'm good. I'm just going to hit stop here. Yeah, let's talk about something.
So do you want me to read the question? So we've got like a mailbag. We got 2 really high quality questions that have come in over the past week or so.
Yeah, instead of the usual crap we get from you listeners. No, I'm just kidding.
You had to put it that way. No, I didn't mean it that way, but
right.
I thought like, okay, someone served us up a really good question for episode 300. I'll read it, but basically I'm going to summarize it first. The question was, what is identity at the center all about? And not the podcast necessarily, but the theme, the idea that went behind the name Identity at the Center.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Good. I made you laugh right before we hit record here.
I know. I almost couldn't speak normally.
Or as normally as you can speak, anyway.
I was going to say, that's not that normal.
I mean, you left that. That was a fastball right down the middle, Jim, and I turned on that one.
Episode 300, Jeff. What do you think?
300. Crazy, man. What a year for milestones. I mean, 5 years. This is episode 300. We kind of saved this one for ourselves with just the 2 of us. But yeah, I mean, crazy the amount of milestones we're celebrating this year.
Totally crazy. Now, do you remember what our original plan was for episode 300? It was going to be when we started doing YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
It was so exciting and too much of a opportunity. So we've been hitting the YouTube thing pretty hard this year. I think it's official, though, now. We do YouTube.
Yes,
so if you go to our idacpodcast.tv,
yep,
brings you right to our YouTube page.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, I thought about waiting for episode 300, and then we started recording in video recently, like in the last couple of months. I was like, well, let me start practicing stuff because I don't know how to video edit. It's been a long time since I did anything in it, and I think it shows in the production of the videos. It's like, all right, it's kind of basic, but that's fine. I'm learning it. I'll get better at it over time. But yeah, I started just doing it. And it was just like, well, let me start uploading them just to kind of get a feel for it and sort of work out my process. Because I do have to make this manageable because the podcast is not our jobs, Jim. We have real jobs in the real world.
It kind of is our job, but it's not our day job. Our day job is we're consultants at RSM. We've been doing identity strategy for over 20 years, and that's what puts food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a passion of ours that we've been doing for 5 years, 300 episodes, and we're going to continue to do. Who knows? Maybe we'll make it to 500.
Maybe. We'll see. But yeah, it's fun. We're going to keep on doing it. And yeah, episode 300. So congratulations to us, and I think that's it.
That's it. That's it.
That's it. We're on, as the great big Bill Belichick said, we're on to Cincinnati.
We could pop the champagne, but this might be the time where you get the twist off champagne.
Yeah. And I was at a bachelor party weekend for my youngest brother, and I'm good for right now.
You've drank your share.
I did. I mean, I didn't have too much to drink, but I drank more than I normally would. That's for sure. And so did my brother. So he had a good time.
Yeah. Back to dry Jeff.
Yeah. In more ways than one. My dry sense of humor, right? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see. What else?
Another milestone, right? With the 501. Go ahead. I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, this is something that I have been eagerly anticipating since November of last year, but I am proud to announce that we are now officially a 501c3 recognized charitable organization or nonprofit. For those people who are not aware, I actually, with Jim's help, set up a nonprofit organization called IDAC Corp. And the whole intent is to basically help kind of fund the podcast. So if you've been paying attention, basically since the start of the year, we've been starting to do sponsored episodes every so often. We don't do too many. We don't want to saturate it. And again, this isn't our job. So we kind of have to make it easy for us to do. But we'll do maybe like 1 or 2 a month. And hope to kind of offset some of the expenses that we generate just, through this between, software, services. I mean, hard drive storage is getting nuts with the video now. So, stuff like that. But yeah, we're officially, as of now, recognized 501c3. So if you sponsored with us in the past, hey, tax deductible now. So sponsor early and sponsor often.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big milestone. And Jeff, you put a lot of work into that. Really appreciate all the hard effort. I think that's the thing with the podcast, not just this thing, but all the work that happens in the background with scheduling the awesome guests that we have, the sponsors that we have, all the post-production editing that goes into it, the LinkedIn posts, and now running it basically like a official charity / business almost. I mean, It's the same level of effort. It's just there's no profit at the end of the day.
Right. And yeah, we have to track expenses and reimbursements and all that stuff. It's we're officially like a real company now.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is, though, I mean, a lot of money went into this over the past 5 years, the past 300 episodes. We started out with a Teams call and record it to an MP4 file or MP3 file and throw it up there on the potosphere. But now it's, we've upped our level, upped our game in terms of audio quality, these kind of microphones, things like that. The Riverside platform that we record on, that would be a good sponsor.
Riverside, don't name products until they sponsor us. Exactly. Whatever platform we use. You didn't hear what Jim just said.
Yeah. But it wasn't cheap, and we've been doing it for a few years. So,
it's exciting. Look, it's been fun.
I thought.
Yeah, and going forward, I think we hope to make at least enough to cover the podcast expenses, and hopefully maybe fun travel to fun conferences like Europe next year, maybe for EIC, stuff like that. So we'll see. But we do it primarily for the lulls, and that's it.
Yeah. So let's actually turn episode 300 into a real episode where we talk about identity.
Nah, I'm good. I'm just going to hit stop here. Yeah, let's talk about something.
So do you want me to read the question? So we've got a mailbag. We got 2 really high quality questions that have come in over the past week or so.
Yeah. Instead of the usual crap we get from you listeners. No, I'm just kidding.
You had to put it that way. No, I didn't mean it that way, but
right.
I thought okay, someone served us up a really good question for episode 300. I'll read it, but basically I'm going to summarize it first. The question was, what is identity at the center all about? And not the podcast necessarily, but the theme, the idea that went behind the name Identity at the Center. And so I'm going to read this off, and we did protect the identity of the person who submitted the question they asked us to.
We'll put them in a witness protection program.
Exactly. So I'm the director of IAM at XYZ organization. In the phase 0 assessment to modernize our legacy identity system. Myself and engineers have been listening to your show for quite some time, and so many topics resonate. So
thank you very much. Cha-ching. Thank you.
Cha-ching. Yeah. My problem is we don't have IDAC, and we want IDAC. We have identities coming in from the business side, students, affiliate side, and federated partner sides. This creates significant issues across enterprise systems. The question, what does the center actually look like? Are all identities created and managed in one place? I would love to see a simple design for what right looks like and understood that looks different everywhere from the consultant perspective, but still need the ability to explain the concept to executives.
So what is identity at the center? So first of all, one, thanks for listening, and engineers. And clearly this is an education side of things. We're talking about students. So I think we've said this before. Education tends to be one of the most complex identity and access management scenarios you can have, especially when you consider the number of roles and the dynamic context switching that people go through. You can be a student who is all of a sudden a part of the, an employee who could potentially also be a parent. They could be a teacher and everything in between, and sometimes all in the same day. So very complex, which I don't know if a lot of people recognize just how difficult sometimes managing all that can be on the education side. So kudos to you for thinking about that. What does the center look like? I mean, this is now we're starting to get a little bit into philosophy, I think, of how you want to manage this. But I'm going to throw this idea out there because here's what I think. The center of the universe, from an identity perspective, in my mind, is whatever your identity and access management system or identity governance, whatever those collection of technologies look like, is you're going to have the center of the universe somewhere that's tracking and storing all that information. Maybe it's one system like an IGA, or maybe it's a couple systems like you've got some people in IGA and maybe some other people in a IDP directory or something like that. But it's really the philosophical construct of where am I centralizing as much of that data as possible to then do stuff with it. So if I have, in the orbit around it, maybe there is a student system, and maybe there is an employee, like a HRS type system, like a Workday, maybe, right? All of a sudden you start to pull in some of that data and you're going into the middle. And then what do you do with that? Well, it's create accounts, and you spin off into other planets that are maybe systems, or maybe other use cases and things like that. So I think it's the idea of you are trying to centralize as much of the identity controls as possible. Not just provisioning, could be authentication, could be privileged access, it could be analytics, audit, like kind of all that stuff. That's what I think of when I think of like identity at the center. It's the identities are at the center of your organization. You are providing as many governance or risk controls as needed to make sure you're protecting the organization and the data you're collecting around that. Thoughts?
That's true. No, that's really cool.
All right, next question.
No, I want to add a few things, but I think that's a big picture look at it. And I made some notes that I wanted to go through. And I think I kind of took it almost from the standpoint of like, when we first started, what did identity at the center mean to me? And it was always that identity was at the center of information security. And I kind of took the idea that it's really, when they talk about identity being the new perimeter, what does that mean? It's that, we're having less of a focus on the perimeter and kind of keeping the bad guys out. And now we're saying that the individual resources, IT resources inside the network, we have to take kind of a zero trust approach, that whether you're inside or outside of that firewall, you have, you can't basically infer trust. Mm-hmm. And so identity essentially becomes the key to the door to get to use that asset or not to use that asset. And I also think it's kind of like it's identity versus IP or information protocol, like TCP/IP. So I think IT security, prior to identity becoming so popular, TCP/IP became the way that you controlled security for much of your network. And it's still that perimeter concept. But now we can't rely on just using TCP/IP as a method for whether or not we trust somebody coming through the door. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of point number one. I think that, identity is also at the center for the architecture of those applications now, right? So it needs to be kind of like built into whether it's infrastructure or applications, that there's an expectation that identity becomes a key way to secure them, and that identity is usually external to the application or the device. So identity is, potentially like coming like from an IDP, like you mentioned. So that was point number one. I'm actually going to be flipping pages. So identity at the center of information security, I think, is point number one. identity at the center of business. So there's a couple concepts here. First is, I want to say identity is the person, right? Identity isn't the account. So if you're doing...
I don't always agree with that, but go ahead.
I know you don't always agree with that, but to me, this is an important thing. So if you are doing business with one person, but they have accounts over multiple applications. So a lot of this has to do with, especially on the business side, has to do with what is the use case that you're trying to solve. But now let's say you're an association or university. You've got all these applications. You have all of these accounts, and they each have metadata about the account, which from their perspective, that is the identity. But now you want to take, as an organization, you want to have a bigger picture of that person across all these applications. You need to have a way to recognize that and correlate that they are one identity, one person owns all of these accounts. And that if there are deltas in the metadata, those need to be worked out. So I kind of see the ability to connect those accounts as kind of very powerful and very important to the business to be able to recognize that identity across all these systems. And that could be from a marketing perspective, for example, being able to tell buying patterns and predict what that user might want to do next. Ultimately, you need to tie that back to an identity. A lot of that marketing data also is not identity data. Like your buying patterns, I don't think are part of your identity. I think the identity ties back to who you are, but we can't just have an open book to say everything is identity data. Your buying patterns, all of your privacy and context information, those need to be stored in separate systems, and the identity needs to tie all those things together. What are your thoughts?
I mean, yeah. Yes to everything. I feel like we're talking kind of the same language. We definitely started with this idea of, identity is the new perimeter. Okay, well, that was 5 years ago at least. So it can't really be called the new perimeter anymore. I would say identity is the current perimeter. So people need to update their vernacular around that. But yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but it also depends on the organization too. What does center mean for them? Because center could be, we have a centralized team that's doing that, versus we're a very decentralized organization that doesn't have a central team do that. So I like everything you said. I feel like it echoes a lot of the stuff that I said. So good answer.
I've got a couple more.
Okay.
I'm going to keep going if I can.
All right. So, you're very clearly prepared.
I'm very clearly prepared. So first thing was really the internal security concept of identity is at the center of your security tooling and the way you should approach securing your infrastructure. The second thing is around building business models based on identity. So, it's talking about identity at kind of the center point of connecting accounts and connecting data that ties back to a person. I also think on that same business channel that identity is now creating new business models. And so the first one that comes to mind is decentralized ID and organizations wanting to become the focal point for an identity and basically have that identity information and look at that as an asset and a way to differentiate themselves in the market and get ahead of their competition.
But when you say decentralized identity, that leads me to believe things like blockchain based, right? Or things like that, where there is no center by design. It's a bunch of nodes that sync up somehow to each other, but you're still working off of the same platform or chain or whatever you want to call it. So how does that work from a centralization standpoint?
So I'm not really thinking about that technology per se, but I am thinking of let's imagine a scenario where, say a credit card company becomes a decentralized identity provider. And if you're to present that identity, you need to come back to that center to validate that that data is, issued by them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So-
I mean, so what's the difference between that scenario that you described, right, where you have, let's say you've got a bunch of decentralized platforms, right? One's finance, one's medical, another might be education, another might be government. It really looks, feels, and smells like, to me, it's just another version of a social IDP, right? We had this process like, okay, well, stop creating accounts and let's use your Google account to log in, or your Facebook account, or your LinkedIn account, or XYZ. I feel like we're headed down that same path again, where it's like, okay, use my finance account chain to log into finance things. Use my government account login to log into that chain, right? Things like that.
Yeah.
Does it feel familiar at all?
It totally does. To me, there's kind of like the stickiness of the identity. Remember a bunch of years back when Facebook bought WhatsApp,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like the amount of money they paid for it was like stunning, shocking to everybody. And it wasn't, I don't think, because they were buying the technology, the ability to make phone calls and video calls, right? That technology could have been had for a lot less money. It was all the identities that they had.
Mm-hmm.
And the more identities they could pull into the platform, the more it became central to their business, that they could grow their business, because basically their business is putting advertisers in front of eyeballs.
Mm-hmm.
I think the stickiness of the identity becomes central to a lot of business models. Federated identity is a big driver of that as well. So, if you're using your Google account or your Microsoft account to log in across multiple platforms, that's feeding into that business model. It's more people on that platform. And that's why you can get so many free services from different providers like Microsoft, like Google. Like,
Nothing's
could you imagine paying for? Yeah, it's not. If it's free, what do you always say?
You're the product if it's free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was my next angle. That I think identity is at the center of business for certain businesses. The last thing I think you touched on, which is it's becoming at the center for governments. So especially like government to citizen communication, more and more delivery of those services and management of those services is happening online. If you're a county government, for example, you're providing a number of services through different departments within your government. Now, you don't want your citizens to have a different ID for each one of those services, right? You want to have one central ID, and then all of those services, their web delivery to leverage that common identity. So I think that's important. And then also from the back end, now that you have that tie, even though you might not have different identities in the back end, you want to be able to pull that data and say, what is John Q. Public doing with X, Y, and Z service? Now, I know there's privacy implications, all that, but let's just put that aside for the moment. You have the ability to now report across different platforms, all tied together with the identity.
Yeah. Well, I think the government side is definitely, it's coming along. Doesn't move as quickly as I think people hope, right? Everybody has like X number of government accounts. I think, at least in the US, you've got login.gov. You also got things like ID.me, which are kind of at the top level from a government, a federal government perspective. And then you've got your state government, and then you might have, your local governments and wherever you're at. It'd be nice to have, a single account, like, my North Carolina ID, or for you, my Georgia ID or something like that. Why not just use login.gov at that point? I mean, it's just, you have that probably already for your taxes anyway.
Right. Well, there's competing services, right? And so, but I think what you're seeing happening, like we're going to be at Identity Week America in just a couple of weeks now, maybe a month. And I was looking at the agenda today. There were several sessions about mobile driver's licenses. I think the state organizations are communicating with one another, and there's central organizations that are trying to drive the adoption of standards. So Even given the decentralized nature of our government, of the federated system, it's amazing to me to see how much progress they've actually made.
Yeah, I feel like mobile driver's license sounds exciting, and then I were like, oh yeah, it's not in my state, and then I just forgot about it because I can't take advantage of it.
Right. Well, it's one of those things that it's probably like AI. It's kind of like an idea, and then all of a sudden it hits.
Yeah. So in 5-10 years, whatever the cycle is, where, okay, now more people are using it. It's kind of like the real ID switch here in the US, where everybody had to go and get a new driver's license if they want to fly, basically. Yeah. And I think the cutoff is it over already, or is it in the next couple of months? I don't know. They've shifted it a bunch of times because it's taken a long time to roll out.
I never worried about it too much because it didn't affect me because I was on one for a long time.
Yeah. I've had mine for a while too, just for how much is I fly. Wanted to get that taken care of right away.
Yeah, exactly.
But can you use a mobile driver's license at a TSA checkpoint, or do you still have to have the physical card with you?
I don't know.
I have to look that up. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I have to research that one. But there's a use case where it's like if I still need it to fly, the value is extremely limited for me.
Yeah. You'll be happy you have it when you get pulled over.
I rarely, I can't remember the last time I was pulled over. I probably was like a teenager.
Yeah. No, I got pulled over maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because I rode right near my house. And the weird thing was the police officer asked me, like, well, why were you speeding? And I said, well, I've been having problems with my transmission. It wasn't shifting. And this was a true story. So I was like stepping on the gas to see what the shifting points were. He's like, yeah, doesn't sound very likely. They went back and wrote me a ticket. I was like, great.
Yeah, it's fine. Do that out on a country road somewhere versus,
I guess so,
outside of a school or something. I don't know.
I was doing it where it was happening. So.
Right. Yeah. I get it.
So that is all I have for that question, Jeff. I hope we addressed it right.
I don't know if I mean maybe. I feel like he gave us an out with understanding that it looks different from different consultant perspective, but I guess from an education standpoint, I still think trying to centralize as much of that data, identity data, to do stuff with provisioning, deprovisioning, single sign-on, adaptive MFA, right? All the bells and whistles. I think as much of that as you can pull into the middle somewhere. Again, it doesn't have to be one system. Maybe it's a collection of IAM systems that are doing this. I think that maybe helps articulate it to some degree, because once you've got it there, then, you can do whatever you want with it. Let's go off and provision those accounts. Let's make things that are self-service. Let's run it analytics and behavior analysis, right? And all kinds of stuff like that. Let's adopt a single sign-on and provide options where you can switch your context based on whatever your role is at the time. Okay, I'm logging in as a teacher or faculty. I'm logging in as a student. I'm logging in as a parent, right? Whatever that looks like. I think you're in a better position for success if you can centralize as much of that data as possible.
The higher ed space is very difficult, even if things kind of just operated like, all right, there's these various personas, and we cut the politics. You just said we have these various personas and we have to make them work. Mm-hmm. That would be hard enough. But layer on top of it, someone at a higher ed client once told me, it's like, what gets confused in the university system is people confuse academic freedom for administrative freedom. And so you had people who were responsible for managing IT systems saying, we have to have our own directory. We can't leverage a common directory. I've worked with some higher ed clients who put the kibosh on that and insisted that they do centralize certain things, and they've been decades ahead in terms of their approach. I've seen other clients where it's like nobody ever put the kibosh, and they're still dealing with those issues where it's like it's hard to do anything from a centralized perspective. It's hard to do a centralized email domain even, or an Active Directory, because there's so much administrative freedom that is allotted to the colleges that they're just going off and doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's true for, I think, a lot of any organization where you allow splitting of IAM functionality and resources and, different services, you're going to run into that issue at some point.
So we had another question. Do we have time for another question?
Yeah, let's roll.
All right. So this question was from our listener, Scott. Jim, it might be interesting to have a discussion on the Identity at the Center podcast about how you confirm identity when you have a user on the phone. We have historically used the last four of a person's SSN, but with all the recent releases of SSN data, we're no longer sure that's a secure method to confirm identity.
I think this is such a good question that highlights something that I find in almost every client that I work with is weakness in how do you authenticate callers to the help desk. Jim, is that you? Yep. Okay, here's your password. That's basically what a lot of organizations do. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's basically the same thing. You're asking for public pieces of information that are already out there, whether it's an SSN or tell me who your manager is that I can find out on LinkedIn, right? All kinds of stuff like that. It's a good question because I think it highlights an area that is maybe not addressed very well either by the identity market. I can think of one or two products maybe that kind of fit in this space. And I think this is a real challenge for a lot of organizations because they do fall back on SSN or they fall back on, well, what's your phone extension, right? Little pieces of information that are really not, easy or not difficult to try and find.
Yeah, you painted the example perfectly. So I, again, wrote down a bunch of notes. Wanted to give these questions a fair shake. So I went out to the ID Pro body of knowledge. And by the way, a plug for ID Pro, fantastic organization, very reasonable fee to join. And the Slack channel is worth the money. Just seeing the conversation or being able to drop your questions on that Slack channel and get responses, fantastic. The body of knowledge is also very, very good. Mm-hmm. And so Dean Sachs, I hope I get that.
Yep, that's Dean. We got to have Dean on the show, by the way, because we'll segue. At Identiverse, he had a talk about what happens to identities after people pass on. And I was like, we have to talk about that. It's not a subject we talked about, but what happens in that scenario. So I know that we got to get him on. So Dean, if you're listening, we haven't forgotten. We're going to get you on. Oh, go ahead.
Dean,
Dean Sachs.
Reach out because I'm giving you major props here. So I read your body of knowledge article on account recovery, and you had a statement in there that went something like the account recovery process needs to be stronger than that which is recovering. So in other words, if you're trying to recover a password, it's got to be stronger than a password. If you're trying to recover a second factor, it's got to be stronger than the second factor that you're trying to recover. So I thought that was pretty genius. And I found that kind of after I wrote some of these notes. So hopefully I don't negate anything that I just said, but I thought that was great. I'd get out there for everybody and read that article. It's in version 3 or something.
Which is great because I was just going to point that out. It's the account recovery V3. If you go to idpro.org, click the link for body of knowledge, you'll see one of the articles there is account recovery V3, which is great because a lot of times people write articles and you just let it sit and then the information comes out of date. So kudos for updating.
Yeah.
And I'll put a link in our show notes too.
Yeah, put a link. That would be great. So, okay. So common faulty practice, I think, is what Jeff just said. Any kind of KBA. So what's your mother's middle name? Or what's
your favorite podcast? Of course, everyone's going to put identity in the center.
Of course. It's what color is grass? Got to get that right. So then I came up with kind of good practices. So first things first is I think the best starting point is to minimize the number of calls that people are going to have to make and have to identify themselves in the first place. So this whole space is around identity verification. If you're getting hundreds of calls, it's going to overwhelm your help desk, and they're going to be more under the gun to close tickets, etc.
Humans will human.
Humans will human. So if you can use self-service password reset, for example, you're going to cut those calls. You're going to have fewer people calling into the help desk in the first place. I think the next thing is kind of like around this subject is training the help desk to the extent that you can on social engineering. So social engineering was behind, and I hate like naming breaches or companies that got breached, but MGM, and there was a big YouTube.
Well, swap out any company name. Chances are the reason they got breached was probably through social engineering.
Yeah, social engineering. And it's like, it's not just your one-off teenager hacker. There's whole organizations built around this, and they're experts of social engineering. So train your help desk on what to look out for. If you don't know, then get on AI and start asking it like questions so that you can train your help desk, and hopefully they recognize it's the same as phishing, right? Corporate email, you get all these like phishing emails where you get pretty good at spotting them after a while.
But that's getting harder now with AI writing these a lot better and people putting more information around out there. It's becoming difficult to spot. You used to be able to say, okay, well, this is clearly, doesn't make sense from whatever language you're fluent in. This doesn't make sense. Now it's almost indistinguishable. So I don't think you can count on that anymore. But you're absolutely right. Like what to look for. I would also say call your help desk and test them. Do a little bit of pen testing on your own, right? And see what you can get away with, and start to realize, where some of the issues might be and where you want to focus training, right? Or other processes to help with that too. Yeah.
And some of these things I'm going to mention are like short-term things that you can do, like call the person back on a known number, use caller ID. Hopefully, you're not getting spoofed on the caller ID, which is something that a advanced hacker would probably have in place. Third-party verification tools like Experian, I think, is one where you can start asking questions like, which of the following cars did you ever own?
Right. Yeah.
Those ones are, you're not going to ask everybody those ones. But if you start to get somebody who, can't answer some of the basic questions, but just really needs to be unlocked. This is actually one thing that this triggered for me was there's a difference if somebody is calling and they need to identify themselves to change the password to kind of a low risk thing versus if it's somebody who needs access to an employee account, for example, that's going to put them into the trusted network and let them start a data breach. So,
yeah, let alone admin accounts, right? If I'm an Okta admin calling in for a password reset, that should immediately set off a different process to verify that person.
Right. But your help desk has to identify these are, kind of a level 1 type of account or whatever. And everybody's going to assign their own risk to some of these things. But I guess what I'm saying is not all these processes are appropriate for all levels of unlock. I think things that are in here until I got to that last one are things that potentially you could employ regardless. Now, best practices, I think, for identity verification are some biometric-based system. So starting to think about like that selfie thing where you hold up your ID, like your driver's license or a passport, and you do a live selfie test. Those things, if you can get those in place, like long term, that's going to put you in a much better position to do unlocks.
But it's relatively advanced and kind of expensive for what it does. Especially when you try to think about different identity assurance levels, 1, 2, 3, whatever it might look like. Yes, it's the best. Is it realistic, though, for a lot of companies? Probably not. Maybe finance, maybe. I could definitely see the medical, but medical typically or health generally don't have as much money to spend on stuff like that until there's a problem. Government, for sure. I mean, they're kind of doing that now for a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so dialing back to good, I think even multi-factor authentication, being able to send a code to somebody. Look, I mean, if you and I fly Delta a lot. If you use their chat application, within their chat application, they require you to go out and re-authenticate. So anything like that where...
The chat works for you? Usually it's just me trying to get help on a flight, and the in-flight Wi-Fi stinks, and so it doesn't ever work.
There you go. There you go. So I think some of those solutions are certainly things that you can get value from at a low cost, especially if we're talking about a large customer base. When you're talking about employee access, I think one thing you said there, it's unfortunate. It's like people aren't going to take this seriously until they get hacked.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then we might as well just shut up, stop doing this podcast.
Let's get rid of that's it. Identity is no longer at the center. It's just a free for all, and have fun with all the data.
Yeah. But I think the last point I want to make on the identity verification stuff is you said, well, it's very expensive. It might be too expensive for you, but I think it's worthy of doing the research and going back and seeing if you can build a business case. It certainly could reduce your risk profile.
Yeah. Maybe it makes sense for a certain population too, right? Executives, admins. This does not have to be a binary all or nothing type approach. Right. I think you need to figure out where the risk is and how much, money do you want to apply to reduce that risk.
Amen.
How do you feel about sending an SMS to an employee? Maybe you know what their cell number is, hey, I'm going to text you a code to make sure it's you.
I think that's in the
better than nothing,
good.
Right? I mean, we know the issues with
nothing.
SMS, right? Not the strongest, but better than an SSN, I would say, right?
It's definitely better than KBA because it requires that you either somehow hijack the SMS routing or that you have the person's phone, which is a very real scenario. I'm sure there's also applications you can use to log into the person's account to intercept their SMSs if you know their cell phone credentials.
They're using WhatsApp.
If they're using WhatsApp,
their Facebook account. Yep.
Yeah. So,
but I think if you combine it, maybe with some other options. So maybe it's just as simple as, hey, we're going to send you a text message and ask you a couple of questions to kind of validate it. Better than nothing, and probably better than what most companies, I would argue, are probably doing today.
Yeah, I think that if you came up with a framework that includes a few of these different things, like questions, the KPA, some kind of hardware verification, and then a framework for like certain accounts, you got to be 10 for 10 before we're going to unlock you. Other accounts, maybe if you get 9 out of 10, if you say, I lost my cell phone, I don't have access to my email. It's very real scenarios where that actually could happen. And I think you have to look at the risk associated with. If somebody says, I need all that, and you have their account flagged in your database that they're an administrator, it's like, I'm sorry, you're going to have to call your boss and get him to do something or her.
How do you feel about that? Having, the person's manager get involved in a password reset?
I think for standard resets, it's not a great idea. But I think when you're talking about like an administrator account,
I'm thinking like scenarios where like a lot of companies will maybe have their process where, they recognize maybe that they don't have a good way to validate the caller. And so they say, I need you to, call your manager, or we've sent you the new password to your manager, call them for the password or something like that, right? Some sort of secondary step that kind of goes through the process.
Right. I mean, I could see that scenario getting socially engineered.
Anything can be socially engineered, but
yeah, it's better than just asking a social security number and then just handing over the password. So
stop using SSN. It's not secret anymore, and it's not secure. And don't use employee number either. Like I see a lot of organizations like, oh, employee number, and then they print it on their badge. Like, okay, well, that's not secret anymore either.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that the primary factor is the risk that you are being socially engineered, and I think there's certain accounts, and there's quite a few accounts within the organization that you just can't afford to have that happen. And inconveniencing somebody is a big deal. But let's say the scenario is somebody called you and they said, I work for IBM and I need to, and I'm not picking on IBM, it's the first thing that came to mind. And I manage your servers and I need to unlock this person's account, or I need to unlock my account because I can't fix this production system that's down right now. And then they can answer like some basic information about themselves and who they report to and things like that. All things that maybe they got off of the company's Yammer site or something like that. Now the person potentially could be socially engineered into unlocking that account. In other words, there's a production system down, and if I don't get this thing fixed, I'm going to be fired.
Yeah. Well, what are the odds of, well, I don't say odds, but I mean, that's how attacks work in the real world, is they move up and over and laterally until they find it. They could have breached a regular person's account. They had access to the Yammer. They had access to the corporate directory. They've done, enough recon to find the information on who they want to target and get information around it. And that's how it works. And so they work up and over, right, until they get to what they want.
Right.
Okay. So do we answer the question?
Even, imagine this. They even have the person's password.
Yeah.
And what they're asking you to do is reset the MFA. I just got a new iPhone today.
Yeah. And they want to re-enroll the device or whatever it may be. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to do it.
Hopefully that adds some color. I don't think there's a black and white answer. It depends on your situation, and it's about hardening the process to the appropriate level.
But I think we can agree that SSN is no longer, it hasn't been for a long time, but if you're using knowledge-based authentication, and especially knowledge that is leaked or easily obtained, right? Whether it's an SSN that's part of a massive leak or something that I can go on LinkedIn and do a little recon and say, okay, well, now I know who that person's manager is, right? Or things like that. Right. It's to move away from stuff like that and maybe shift to looking at different risk-based models based on the type of user or who's calling in, right? Or some of those different kind of options.
Right.
But not SSN. Don't use SSN. No. I'm going to draw a line right there in the sand.
Agreed. All right. Well, thanks to Scott for that awesome question.
Yeah, it was a good question. And to our anonymous listener. And hopefully we helped them out with the identity at the center. If not, let us know. Send us another email. We'll take another crack at it. Or we'll hop on a phone and just talk about it. We can do that too.
And Jeff, I'm just sitting here thinking, like, anonymous email kind of sounds like we made it up. I swear we did not make it.
No, they asked to be anonymous, and we're identity and access management professionals, so of course we're gonna honor that.
Of course.
If they feel like sharing, they can post on LinkedIn after they hear this, and they can do their own thing. How about that?
That sounds good.
Okay.
So we should have a lighter note. We should end this thing on a lighter note, since we do that every week. What do you think?
Yep. So episode 300, this is it. What does episode 500 look like? What are we talking about 200 episodes from now? Which is probably, let's call, somewhere between 3 and 4 years from now.
So when you say we, do you mean me and you, or our AI?
Our AI counterparts? Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever episode 500 of the Identity Center podcast sounds like, blank will be the topic that we're addressing, the main topic.
I mean, we talked about the whole thing with mobile driver's licenses, and I think that's going to be very much our reality, and we'll probably be having discussions about whether or not they should be used by more things, if we should be using mobile driver's licenses as kind of like a federated identity capability to authenticate to more things. So I do think that's a real one. And I think AI, it's like, what are all the possibilities that AI can bring to the things we do today? I don't think that AI is going to be at the point where it's managing large pools of identity implementations. But I do think some of like what we discussed with Merrill, where you can go into your system and just use human language models, human language to say what you want it to do. And we're starting to see the fruition of that come forth. What do you think?
I hate to say it, but we're probably going to be talking about the same stupid things. People aren't using MFA or whatever the basic securities of the time. How do I sell IAM to my organization? People just haven't gotten buy-in yet, or maybe they sold it once and they need funding again to catch up because they didn't sustain the investment to stay current. I hate to say it, but I have a feeling we'll be talking about stuff like that. But AI for sure. I don't think it's going away. Trying to think what else. Episode 500. I mean, 3 to 4 years from now, haven't we been like 3 to 4 years away from like blockchain identity? Now, like, is this the next 3 to 4 years? I'm sure it's coming along, right? Or the end of the password? Will we still be talking about the death of the password at that point?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. I don't mean it to be pessimistic, right? These are conversations that take place in every organization. Is, we continually have to sell the value of identity and access management, and how do we do that? Because there's always going to be competition for dollars and resources to get things done, and no organization is unlimited. Well, maybe a couple, but there are the exceptions. So there's always going to be that conversation of, okay, well, what's new? How are we staying current or ahead of the curve, right? What are the new threats that are coming about? AI, I'm sure, is going to introduce things we haven't thought about. I'm sure somebody's going to get creative, and quantum is going to become a thing. And we're going to be talking about, well, how do we make sure that quantum is not wrecking all of our security algorithms, right? Things like that. So there will be things, but fundamentally, we're still going to be talking about the same thing. Do the right people have the right access to the right thing at the right time? And is that access appropriate? There we go.
That was good. Good. Hey, I just thought of something else. We never mentioned that we got accepted to play a part, to present a use case at the Gartner IAM Summit in December of this year.
It's been a big couple of weeks, man. Yeah.
It has been, man. It's like you can barely keep up with the good things happening. But on that front, I'm working the angle to try to get us a discount code. And of course, we won't have a discount code unless it's the best one. So keep your ears on the podcast. Hopefully we'll have a discount code for the Gartner IAM Summit here coming up.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting. I think I had such a good time at the last one doing the on-stage sort of a mini Identity at the Center with Becky and Henrique on stage, and we may try to do something similar to that again. But yeah, it's an honor to be nominated, and I'm looking forward to doing whatever it is we're going to do there.
Yeah, and shout out to Becky, because she really shepherded us through the process here. So very grateful for that.
Becky's good IAM people. How about that?
That's a good point.
All right, let's see. Anything else? I know we're going to be at a bunch of conferences. I'll just put all of our discount codes in the show notes. It's also on our homepage at idacpodcast.com. So I try to keep that updated now. If you just scroll down just a little bit, you'll see the different discount codes for Identity Week, Authenticate Conference, the Semperis Conference, HipConf, basically. And then if we end up with something for Gartner, it'll be there too. But we'll have all that in our show notes. And hopefully people come out and either say hello or support us. Use the codes as the best way to support. Show that we can bring a party to these types of things and have some fun at these conferences.
Heck yeah.
Yep. All right. idacpodcast.com, at IDC Podcast on X, or whatever it's called at this point. idacpodcast.tv. Please give us a like and subscribe. We are trying to grow that channel as much as we can. And if you're listening to this while you're walking around, which I know some people do, just click over to the YouTube real quick and just hit like and subscribe. It means a lot for us. Let's see what else. And connect with us on LinkedIn. Definitely get good questions like we got today. And we'll keep bringing it. And hopefully you guys keep listening. So with that, we'll leave it there for this week. Thanks everyone for watching or listening. And we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.